Tonight I want to talk about the legend Caleb, who lived during the 400 years of slavery in the land of Egypt. The oppressive rule of Pharaoh had been very heavy on the Israelites, and it was very demonic in how they were treated, to the point that they began to cry out to God for a deliverer. At the time, Moses had went to the far side of the desert, and God had called him to come back to deliver the Israelites. Caleb would have been a very young man when Moses came onto the scene, and Caleb would have been part of that crowd saying, "Lord, send someone to deliver us." And sure enough, Moses arrived. We can watch all the movies, and if you've seen Prince of Egypt, you know what that was like. Moses came in and said, "Set my people go." And Pharaoh decided not to do it. 9 times he called on him to do that, and 9 times God sent a plague, and it was the 10th plague, the one that changed everything, the plague that took the firstborn. And Moses went back and said, "Pharaoh, will you let my people go?" And he said, "Get out of here, Moses, and take your people with you." So they did. They packed up all their stuff, and it says that they even took plunder from the Egyptians, almost saying that they were going to get paid for all the years of slavery that they had went through. So they plundered Egypt on their way out, and they headed out into the wilderness until they came to the point of the Red Sea. And what is interesting, they're between 2 mountains, and Caleb is here for all of this. He's watching with those young eyes and that young mind. He's watching Moses as he leads 1 million to 3 million people out of Egypt. And they come up to the Red Sea, and they're standing there, and they're like, "We're going to have to turn around or do something because we can't cross the Red Sea." When they realize that Pharaoh had changed his mind and had sent the Egyptian army to come and hunt them down. And I want you to imagine what that might have been like for a moment. The Red Sea ahead of you, the past chasing you, no future ahead because it's nothing but obstacles, and they have an army, the past, still chasing you. Can you imagine your past still chasing you and it doesn't look like you have a future? Well, Moses, he goes into the water and he raises the staff and he plunges it into the water, and the water forms walls on both ends, and the ground is dry. The whole time Caleb is sitting there like, along with all the other Israelites. You know, something they had never seen, arguably the greatest miracle the world has ever witnessed, as they walk through on dry land. And they go through, and the Egyptian army is chasing them, and they get through the Red Sea, and they get to the other side, and the Egyptian army sees them go through, I'm sure amazed. Which always amazes me about the story is they're chasing these people who are God's people. They just went through 10 plagues, and now they're going to try chasing them through the Red Sea. At what point do you realize these are people we probably don't want to deal with, right? Yeah. But they get into the Red Sea, and they go to chase them, and the walls of water that had formed as a pathway for them, the Israelites, to walk through, begin to wash over them and swallow them up. The whole time the Israelites are watching what God is doing. Nothing they had done. They sit and watch how God had not only delivered them from Egypt and from the Egyptian army, but had opened up a pathway into a future. I'm sure at this time Caleb's thinking, wow, we are living in the days that our forefathers had talked about, that God had promised, the promised land. And so there was an excitement as they pursued in the direction that the promised land was at. And they're going through the wilderness, making their way, and they come to the Jordan River. And Moses says, okay, we're at the promised land. Now I want 12 of you, 12 leaders, 1 leader from each tribe. I want you to go into the promised land, into Canaan, and I want you to spy out the land and come back and report to us what you find. So Caleb and Joshua and the other spies, they take off. They go into the promised land, and they go from one place to another, and they check out everything, and they make meticulous notes, and then they turn around and they come back. and they meet with Moses, Aaron, and the community of Israel. And they're sitting talking with them, and they're like, this place is amazing. Big houses, big king-size beds. They got fruit it says that they brought back a bunch of grapes that 2 people had to carry on a stick. That was so massive. That the fields are just amazing. The land has dark, fertile soil. The everything is amazing, and you can hear the murmuring among the people, the excitement that's starting to build. This is the promised land. This is our land. This is what God's going to give us. The people are excited because God has said this is ours, and He just delivered us from the Egyptians, and we got all their stuff, and then we get in the Red Sea, and we don't have to worry about the past because He buried it in the Red Sea, and He made a way in our future, and now we're here, and that's when the music changed. Da-da-da. The spies, 10 of them at least, said, but there's a problem. And immediately the hush comes over the community, and they listened to what the 10 of the spies had to say. They said, it's all wonderful and it's amazing, but one thing we noticed while we were there are giants in the land. We felt like grasshoppers in their eyes. They had went to that place and had been so overwhelmed by the giants, even though they saw all that God had promised them, it was out of touch in their mind. They would never get to that place because there were giants in the land. And they said, there's no way we can overcome them. In fact, they said they're the sons of Anak, which would have been the sons of the Nephilim, which is like these monster of men. And they even said, they're there. So it's a foregone conclusion. We can't take the land. And immediately the murmuring started in the crowd. What do you mean? You just told us how amazing this is. You got our hopes up to have them come crashing down? You mean we've come all of this way and we can't get into the land? And they started talking amongst themselves, and you can imagine all the excitement. You've just been through everything you've seen, and now you're here, and the giants, the people forgot what God had just done. Yeah. They were overwhelmed by the same fear of the giants that the 10 spies. And it was about that moment that Caleb made this statement. They disagreed with the negative reports. They listen, guys, we can do this. This is something we can do. If the Lord is with us, we can do this. If we don't disrespect the Lord, if we don't doubt the Lord, if we only believe that He will be with us, we can take this land. Don't be discouraged by the giants. They cannot compare to the God that we serve, the God of the Red Sea. They even said, remember what He just did. Remember what we just witnessed. And what was interesting, it said that the people were so angry with Caleb and Joshua and Moses and Aaron that they wanted to stone them. In fact, they would have stoned them if it hadn't been for the glory of God that had fallen over the place where they were standing, that protected them from the people. At that point, God became very angry. And God said, I am ready to destroy these people who do not believe in me. Do they not remember what I just did? Did they not see what just happened, the miracle? I mean, what can I do to get them to actually trust me and believe me? You can imagine how frustrating that must have been for God. Like I did something so incredible right in front of them. How many more things do I need to do? And Moses says, God, you cannot destroy these people because these people are known as your people. And if you destroy them, it will cause them to see you in the character of that destruction. And God changed His mind, but He said, listen, those people will never enter the promised land. In fact, only 2 of the people that were living at that time would enter the promised land. Those 2 people, Joshua and Caleb, the 2 that never doubted God, who believed that God could do what He promised He was going to do. God said, you know what? You will see the land. What's interesting, the people said, it would have been better for us to die in Egypt or in the desert than to die in the promised land. I mean, how broken. Think about that. When you're afraid of something, when you're living in fear, reason doesn't register.
Right. Yeah.
That you would rather die in oppression and slavery or in a desert where there is all kinds of want than trying to pursue the promise God has for you. Think about it. You know, it was interesting when the people realized what they had done and Moses said God was going to destroy you, but your life has been spared. The people then tried to go to the promised land only to be defeated. They then, when God had pronounced the judgment that you will never enter the promised land, they actually tried to then enter the promised land because it was almost like, whoa, now God's not with us. Let's go try to do it. And they failed. You know where those 10 spies and the people of Israel died? They died in the desert. God gave them what they had asked for. But the 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, that said we can take this land, they died in the promise. You know, it's amazing how a negative spirit can impact our future and our lives. There's a difference between a negative spirit and what I'm going to call a Caleb spirit. The exception of Joshua, I'm going to read this scripture in Numbers. It said, the exceptions were Joshua and Caleb. From everyone else, the exception was Joshua and Caleb. And he says, but because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Wow. You know, there are 5 comparisons I want to talk about. And in these comparisons, I want you to think about how there is a legacy that we will leave for our children. The first one is a negative spirit grumbles and complains, but a Caleb spirit speaks life. Isn't it incredible how easy it is to complain and grumble about everything? I think a lot of times there are more people that think they have a gift of figuring out what the problem is. I got the gift of telling everybody the problem. It's not hard to figure out what the problem is. It really is something when we become the problem solver.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's easy to grumble and complain. It's easy to look at the things we don't like. It's easy. And I think it's quite natural because in our sin nature, when we were born into a sin nature. Just as they had lived in a land of slavery, when they came to this point, they still, even though they were delivered from Egypt, their brain had not been set free from Egypt. Even though they had been set free from slavery, their mind and their thinking had not yet been set free from the thinking of slavery. And they complained and grumbled about everything. Isn't it easy at times to find ourselves complaining about all the things we don't like? And when we get into that trend of complaining about the things we don't like, we're not paying attention to all of the things that God has done. All of the things that are in our life. A Caleb spirit chooses not to ignore the negative things, but to see how God can do something in them. The second thing is a negative spirit looks back, but a Caleb spirit looks forward. And you could see that in the people. Immediately they went, oh, that we would be back in Egypt. Oh, that we would be back in the desert. The Caleb spirit said, hey, we're this far. Don't stop now. I want to pursue what's ahead. And God is calling us as believers to be a people that look forward and are not looking past in the past, looking back, looking at what could have been, what might have been, but looking at what God is going to do in the future. The third one is a negative spirit focuses on the problem, but a Caleb spirit focuses on the potential. There will always be problems.
Amen.
But in every problem, there's potential for God's power.
Yeah. Yeah.
That God's power is available to every one of us.
Yeah.
And if we look at the problem and we fail to see that God has a plan to cause us to overcome, we'll get discouraged, we'll become overcome by the enemy, and the negative spirit sets us up to always fail.
Yeah.
To always fail. See, a Caleb spirit said, God's going to do something. I can't wait to see what it is. There was joy in his heart because he expected God to do something incredible. The fourth thing is a negative spirit doubts God, but a Caleb spirit believes God. The Israelites, they got set free from Egypt. God did 10 plagues, supernatural things, to bring the Egyptians to a point of saying, "C'est la vie." Get out of here. He brings them to the Red Sea. He splits the waters they walk through. Egyptians chasing them. The past is destroying the very obstacle that was preventing them from their future. They go, move. God sends a pillar by night, a pillar of fire by night, and cloud by day, directs them, gives them the provisions they need. They get to the place he's not only promised them, but he's been promising them for 400 years.
It's crazy.
And they hear about the giants, and they doubt God. How quickly we forget what God has done in our life when we face giants. A negative spirit, a spirit that gets us to focus on the negative, causes us to doubt God. To say, well, he's not going to do it. And the enemy is right there telling us all the reasons why God isn't going to do what he's going to do. But the same God that did what he did in your past when you didn't deserve it is the same God that's going to do what he's going to do in your future when you don't deserve it.
Amen.
If there's one thing I would say in a Caleb spirit, only believe. Only believe. You know why God says only believe? Because you can believe.
Yeah.
Because every single person, when there's nothing else you can do, you can believe.
Yeah.
Believing is more than just knowing. Believing is being fully persuaded that God will do what he said he will do, even when it doesn't look possible, even when the sons of Anak are coming against you.
Yeah.
Amen.
You know, this is amazing. If God is for you, who can be against you? God is for you. What giant can be against you? If God has said something's going to happen, what's going to keep his word from happening? There isn't a demon in hell that can keep God from doing what he's going to do in your life.
Amen.
Here's the last one. A negative spirit wanders in the desert, but a Caleb spirit receives the reward. You know, it's such an incredible thing. They got what they believed for. The people of the spies, and this is an interesting thing, the spies were Joshua, Caleb, and that's right. You don't know any of the other spies. Because when you have a critical spirit, you're a forgotten person.
Yeah.
When you have a negative spirit, you will be forgotten. We remember Joshua and Caleb because they had a Caleb spirit. They had a spirit of faith. And the reward that they received was what they believed was theirs. The people of Israel that denied that they could go in the promised land, didn't believe they could take the promised land, didn't get the promised land. Not because it was impossible to get in the promised land. Caleb and Joshua proved that. They got the promised land because that's what they had faith to believe for.
Yeah.
Joshua and Caleb got the promised land because that is what they believed for. You know, it's an incredible thing. Caleb is now old in age. He's 80-something years old. And he's got this famous line at the end. It's, "Give me this mountain," right? "I'm going to take my mountain." They said, "You sure, Caleb, you want to take?" "I'm taking this mountain," right? At 80 years old, he says, "I'm just as strong today as I was when we said we could take this land." You know why Caleb believed he could take the mountain at 80? Because He knew the promise God gave him back then hadn't changed just because
Yeah.
they were in the
Amen.
wilderness. He had to live through the wilderness because of the doubt of those around him. But he
Yeah.
said one day God is still, he never lost faith. He said, those are my mountains. Now I got to wait 40 years to get there. And it doesn't matter how old I am because the promise, the reward is not dependent on my ability to
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah.
If I am not able to fight for it, God will find somebody to fight for it for me. But I'm getting my mountains.
Right.
I have not lost faith, no matter what takes place. You see, ask. This is the thing I think all of us have to come to in this point. You must ask God, God, give me a Caleb spirit, a spirit that is fully persuaded, that has more to do with God than it does with your ability to fulfill it. God, that spirit where I am not negative, I'm not critical, I'm not like I'm not trying to manipulate God into doing something. Oh, God's never going to do that for my life. That's not what Caleb did, because God doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
God moves in your faith,
Yeah.
not in your fear.
Right.
God moves when you say, God, I believe, I trust you. I'm going to stand with you. It looks impossible, but the Red Sea was impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It looks impossible, but the 10 plagues were impossible.
Yeah.
You got us out of
Yeah.
Egypt. It looked impossible, and you've already promised this. And that's what God did in the life of Caleb. Don't you want the Caleb spirit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know I do. Being a negative spirit, that's easy to come by. But a Caleb spirit, that's a divine touch of God.
Yeah.
Yes.